Today we are really excited and honored to be joined by Dr. Miguel Lopez. Dr. Lopez is an associate professor of multicultural and social justice education at California State University, Monterey Bay. His teaching and research focuses on the role of race, ethnicity, and culture in education. Dr. Miguel Lopez, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Cool. Can you start by telling us just a little bit more about what's important to know about you and the work that you have done in education and social justice?
Sure. I think the way that I often frame myself is that I am the son of educators. My father, Guillermo Lopez, who really is the Dr. Lopez, I don't usually use that term, has been really a lifelong model to me of what social justice education could look like, should look like, and must look like. His own actions as a high school teacher, first of all, a district administrator, and then a leader in the state of California where he was the director of the Office of Bilingual Bicultural Education for many years, set the bar incredibly high for me, but was very grounded as well. His work in the community, his work across languages and cultures, the way he was a leader was always a model to me of how I needed to pursue different thoughts, different ways of doing things, challenging the paradigms, the status quo. And that was part of my early days of understanding what is justice. The second thing that I think is very critical for me is had a great education. K-12 public schools, University of California, Berkeley, go Bears for a BA, MA, PhD. And the chance to work with brilliant people, the Jean Laves of the world, the Guadalupe Valdezes of the world, the chance to be challenged, to really be asked to articulate and think and read deeply. We often talk about being lifelong learners. That's one of the things we want of our teachers. And that was an early bedrock for me of learning how to really think deeply. And then I've been blessed with really almost 30 years of opportunities to go in and out of classrooms, to work all the way from kindergarten all the way up to doctoral students, and has given me a chance to work out my own ideas. I often think that sometimes in the publish or perish world of Tier 1 research institutions, we push young faculty to crystallize their thoughts long before we have enough experience. And I feel now that I'm approaching 30 years of K-12 education, I'm finally getting it.
So for you, what is the social justice perspective on the overall purposes that should guide education? I mean, what would a social justice education be trying to accomplish, for example, for students?
I think a social justice education has a couple of components that have been distilled in my own work. The first is that we begin to think about education not just in that traditional sense of what's between the earlobes, the academic world that we often think about. One of the things that I think is beautiful about a lot of my early work was working with kindergartners in first grade, spent 3 years in a kindergarten classroom. And I think that a lot of us, as we grow as adults, we forget the whole child. We talk about that often, educate the whole child. But if you look at the vast majority of the work that we do, even the great teachers, there's still such an emphasis on this head part, not so much on the soul, not so much on the body. Obviously, the dropping of recess and physical education has taken away the physical. The movement towards reading and writing, which are absolutely essential skills, has moved us away from thoughtfulness about what are the values we want our children to understand. I think particularly an easy way to think about this is how do we understand that a child moves, for instance, between home and school? And that is rarely just, well, what did you read? What did you learn in math? But that's really about who you are as a person. In Spanish, we often think about the notion of being bien educado, to be well educated. And for many of us as Latinos, when we think about that, we translate that into English as being well educated. And I think that's the English cognate. But I like to play with that in this sense. In the classroom, we are well educated in the English sense, which is often our brains, our ability to know facts, to read books, and make a cogent Western argument in that Socratic method, which is absolutely essential. For us as Latinos, and I think across many cultures, the notion of being bien educado is to be respectful, to have manners, to hold oneself with dignity and honor. And I think if you look at the work of someone like Angela Valenzuela and her work on subtractive schooling, if you look at Gloria Ladson-Billings' work on culturally relevant pedagogy, there is this sense in which we need both the academic excellence, the intelligence, the brains. Do we know when the Civil War was? Do we know who our great leaders are? But also, who were those great leaders in terms of their values? And so for a social justice education framework, for me, it's one beginning with continuing to have academic excellence, but bringing in this soulfulness of who we are as people. Which means, therefore, I think we have to think about outcomes as well as the process. Are our kids achieving academically? And sadly, the reality is no, they're not. I can look at every major metropolitan city across the U.S. for youth of color, principally African American and Latinos. And sadly, it is Latinas that are catching up with Latinos in terms of dropout rates. Jeff Duncan Andrade talks about the fact in his work with Ernest Morel, if schools are able to produce dropouts year after year, statistically at the same level, that's not a coincidence, it's a pattern of being. So how do we understand that schooling appears to not be working, particularly for youth of color and low-income youth? To continue to, the status quo, practice as usual, while it may work for some kids, the fact that it's continually not working means we have to change that. So a social justice framework says, not only am I going to look at academic excellence, but I'm actually going to make certain that my curriculum, my pedagogy, the training of teachers, the organization of schools will actually do that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So there are a lot of competing narratives about then how you do improve schools, in fact, and more successfully educate students, particularly students of color. Everybody seems to use the same rhetoric about No Child Left Behind, but the ideas about what to do are very different. So one of the dominant narratives that we hear in urban schools is that schools are challenged in urban low-income communities by increasing numbers of low-income students, bilingual students, migrant students, and families who arrive at school with some sort of cultural or linguistic deficits. What's wrong with that narrative?
Well, I think there's two challenges that narrative requires of us as social justice educators to reconsider. The first is actually, and I take a different perspective on the demographic argument. The demographic argument, at least here in California, has been with us for decades, if not centuries. I think we can go all the way back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and recognize that we were already a, quote, bilingual state in the sense of the preponderance of Spanish. For those of us that work out of a Chicano-Chicana kind of understanding of the world, we're returning to Aztlán. And the language has always been here. Let's now embrace that as a long historical reality, which means the beginning perspective that I take on even looking at a child now in 2014, be that child in kinder, be that child in 12th grade, be that child be a recent immigrant whom we often say speaks no English, though I would argue they probably do quite well, Coca-Cola, no, etc. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if we think about the fact that one child, let alone thousands of child, deserves a world-class education, to use the language of No Child Left Behind, means it doesn't matter whether there's multiple children in the classroom or only one. We have a responsibility as a society, as the adults in the room, to provide the best education. So that's the first. The second problem with the narrative is it's often, again, and I'll play with this term, a Eurocentric one. It's one in which this is what the curriculum is: speak English, know these particular historical facts and things. And what it often does is forget the fact that a child has already been nurtured and has been raised within a community, within a family, among sisters and brothers. Let me reframe it this way. We often talk about the fact that when we're working with parents, we say a child's parent is their first teacher. But the reality is, often as soon as that child comes into kindergarten, first grade, we do a little pat on the back to the parent and say, job well done, now we'll take over because we're the professionals. And what I'm trying to do in a lot of my work with teachers and working across the country is to say, let's go back to that idea and actually give honor to the fact that parents are their first teacher, and can we in fact say that they continue to be co-teachers with me, the professional who's been credentialed? If we do that, then We no longer see a child's Spanish that they use in the home as a deficit. We now see that as an asset. We no longer look at that cultura mexicana, whatever culture it may be, Greek culture, Chinese culture, as a deficit, something to be added on to with American culture, but actually now becomes the source of great intelligence, wisdom, ways of understanding. Luis Moll, an incredible anthropologist out of Arizona who's doing, I think, great battles within that state and its politics, uses this notion of what he calls the funds of knowledge, he and his colleagues and associates, Norma Gonzalez et al. And as an anthropologist wants to say, wow, these homes are rich with ways of understanding that fathers and mothers go out and work every day. And to be able to do that work, they have to understand how to build something, how to sing something, how to do whatever. And can that be the beginning of an additional set of ways of understanding the world? We often talk, well, we need to prepare children for the 21st century work world. Well, their parents are already doing that. So can we say there's already knowledge there? And rather than, quote, replacing that knowledge, use that as the bedrock for building an existing curriculum.
Mm-hmm. So how has that original narrative that there's a deficit, how has that actually impacted students, families, and communities of color, that deficit kind of thinking?
When I think about the deficit model, I think the one idea that most quickly comes to me, on which I've been doing a lot of work, and here I owe great thanks to Guadalupe Valdez from Stanford, her book, Con Respecto, is a beautiful book of helping us rethink parent education, for instance. If you listen to the dominant narrative, particularly, again, when we think about Latino communities and African American communities, and even within the Southeast Asian community as opposed to, and I'll come back to maybe the East Asian community, we often say Latino parents just don't know how to educate, and therefore we're going to give a parent education program, which really means we want you to educate like us. Be junior teachers, do the math homework, do the science homework like white middle-class families do. Annette LaRue's work has really wonderfully, I think, taken us and shown us, well, it's not so much that these folks don't do it right. They do it very consistently with a set of beliefs and values that work for them. And so I think we need to change the paradigm on what is parent education, not so much to make low-income families of color more like white middle-class families, but rather say, what are the ways in which those families are already doing things really, really well, and maybe not well, but build on what they're already doing well. The second way I think that the narrative has had a disproportionately negative impact, again, on children of color, Angela Valenzuela's notion of subtractive schooling, in which children come with this wealth of knowledge and then school says, check that at the door. Check your language at the door. Check the assets that would help you. Obviously, here in California, we have, quote, outlawed bilingual education. We could argue all day on the merits of that, but I think that one of the things that has unintentionally happened is we've told children, the language by which you have communicated well with your parents, now choose another venue. And the unintended consequence is a child that maybe comes in to a classroom in third or fourth grade, in a matter of quick 3 or 4 years has become much more English dominant than Spanish dominant. And we wonder why there's a drifting and a generational break at home. So they may be doing well even academically, but there's a drift at home. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, they're in middle school and high school, and they're acting out. Well, they haven't had the same kind of enculturation at home, at school, because language has become now a barrier. One of the interesting things that I think is a great way to rethink the deficit. In many Latino families, for instance, previously before the border was as difficult as it was to cross, and here I'm linking academics with the larger political scenario, many families would return home to Mexico in December and January because that's a very sacred time for those of us who grew up Catholic. It was a time of family and culture. We can use the Bush idea of family values. It was a time to inculcate children with family values allá en Mexico, in their home and in their culture. Well, what that meant, though, was that for many teachers, that child was missing out on 2 or 3 weeks of important academic work. We separated the family values that we value in Latino culture from the academic. And because they were doing one thing that was beautiful for the family, but not doing the academic, we saw that as a deficit, and we chastised those families rather than saying, okay, let's rethink. Is there something that's going on there that's a beautiful experience? Let me give you a parallel example that might help us rethink deficit. An international student might come from DF, the capital of Mexico, as an international student. And we look at that student as bringing a wealth of knowledge and can contribute to the campus because they're an international student. A Mexicano who's come, documented or undocumented, to the United States, who returns home to DF for that December, January, well, they just missed out on school. We don't look at that rich 2 weeks or 1 month of beautiful cultural thing as something they could bring to the campus. Same student, same basic experience, bringing that wealth of culture. We look at one as a deficit because they're missing out on the academic. The other we look as a cultural asset because they can contribute. Same child, why not look at them under the same lens? Those are some of the ideas I think about when we're thinking about how is deficit really undermined. Let me add one more, actually. I think that what it's done is enabled us as teachers to not have to question our own values. And so one way that I think that we should rethink deficit is, what are the already a priori assumptions I bring into my classroom about as a teacher? What is good teaching? What is a good student? What is good curriculum? Until we begin to question even some of that and our own K through 12 experience, it's going to be difficult for us to reimagine who kids are and their families are.
Mm-hmm. So if educators and schools were doing that questioning and we're really valuing the wealth of knowledge and culture that families and students are bringing to school, what would it actually look like in the classroom? How would a classroom look differently? And how might something like homework look differently as well?
Great question. I think it requires us to rethink again. Let's play with Luis Moll's notion of the funds of knowledge, Tarioso's notion of community wealth. All of those folks talk about how there's something out there. So one of the things that I play with, for instance, is an activity that I call my dichos, or sayings or consejos, bits of wisdom activity. This is a process I've been doing. I've used it all the way from kindergarten up through college. You can go into virtually every classroom, especially elementary, across the nation, and see up on the wall a set of classroom rules, ways of classroom management. Well, I take the same approach. We need to have order in the classroom. We need to be able to get along. But rather than having a list of do's and don'ts, why don't we have a list of ways of being, ways of community building? We often talk about creating your classroom as a community. Well, I'm not certain that the do's and don'ts, don't run, don't eat the paste, raise your hand to talk, are really building community. They're certainly creating a classroom management so I, the teacher, can deliver a curriculum. But I don't think they have the same effect of building a community. So could we, for instance, ask children, what wisdom did your parents give you this morning as you send your child off to school? For instance, every morning when I would walk my son to school, even up until the first years of high school before he was a little too independent for me, but I would give him a bit of wisdom. Respect yourself, respect others, work hard, play hard. Those are some very simple kinds of things. Sometimes I would give different ones in Spanish. But the point was that I wanted him to think not just about doing schoolwork, but about being somebody, treating his classmates with respect, and always the teacher, because that's such a revered position in my culture. So I work with this activity in which I, for instance, have all of my students bring in on the first few days, the weeks. This can actually go up to 3 months once that I did it in one classroom, where I'm asking them to bring in all of their dichos, the ways that their parents talk to them. Now what I've done is I've made homework, not my work as a teacher that, quote, goes home. I call that schoolwork that goes home. Homework for me, tarea in Spanish, is work that can only be accomplished because it requires the participation of the members of the home. In my situation, for instance, when my son was in high school, I couldn't help him with his math. I said, go talk to your sister Leslie because I can't do that. Oftentimes, that's the way we look at homework. You're a junior teacher for me, the classroom. Well, I want to talk about homework in the sense that Every parent has a story about their immigration. Every parent has a story about what they do in their life. Every parent has a story that they can tell. They can therefore be successful with their children in doing homework in the traditional ways of doing math or science I couldn't do. So this parent is child's first teacher. I keep that concept, and now I have them continue to be the teacher. So it's not just give me the dicho. It's now explain to your child the meaning of the dicho. Where did that dicho come from? Was that from your grandmother, your maternal grandmother? Now I'm doing a family tree activity, which we often do. My point is, I want to start with what I know is already part of the curriculum, homework. I want to start with something that's already part of the curriculum, classroom rules. I want to start with something that's already part of the curriculum, something like a family tree. But now I think of ways of incorporating within that children's culture and values. That becomes then part of my, quote, academic discussion inside the classroom. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, the great sociologist out of Harvard, wrote a wonderful book many years ago called Worlds Apart, and she wondered, why is it that we could have a black school right here and a white university right here, and those worlds seem to be worlds apart? Well, I want to bring the worlds closer together by asking that the values and the ways of understanding of the home could be part of the, quote, academic work at school, and that academic work could flow back home. It adds to the change in the paradigm because now my parents are the teacher and the classroom teacher is the learner. And I've shown my students, my college students who are going to become future teachers, you can actually still, quote, control the classroom, the direction of your curriculum without giving up total space and learn. We often in teacher ed programs talk about being culturally sensitive and understanding your communities. We often talk about doing home visits. Well, home visits continues to have that paradigm of we're going into your community to learn how you're doing stuff and oftentimes, unfortunately, evaluating it. Now I'm saying let's bring the home into the school. Think about it this way. What if a child came to school with a piece of wisdom from their mother? Now it becomes part of a sentence strip that I use, and it's now up on the wall. Fast forward to parent-teacher conferences, and that parent comes into the classroom and sees her wisdom on the wall. I think she would feel incredibly incorporated and included into that culture, as opposed to sitting awkwardly across the table from the teacher. An awkward discussion that Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot talks about in another book called I keep forgetting the title. We'll have to come back to this one. Okay. But she talks about the parent-teacher conference and the essential conversation. That's the one. Maybe we can redo that one. Mm-hmm. The essential conversation, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot talks about how in the parent-teacher conference, there's often this awkwardness because neither one knows what the other one's going to do. Well, if I see your wisdom and your child's pictures in the classroom, now I feel as a parent welcome in that classroom. That might help us change the way in which we teachers can think about our responsibility by caring for the communities. We talk in Spanish about cariño, an affection or caring about someone. Could we actually build that as part of our, again, going back to No Child Left Behind, what does it mean to be a highly qualified teacher? Have cariño as well as all the academic.
Beautifully said. You've actually moved some into my next question, but I'll still ask it and see if there's more you might want to add to it. So a lot of schools today, especially in low-income communities of color, are pushing these zero-tolerance behavior policies that criminalize student behavior, fuel the school-to-prison pipeline, and the idea of holding students accountable for their behavior sort of becomes code for punishment and oppression. So I'm wondering, I mean, you've already addressed some of it, but I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts about how a culturally responsive or socially justice-oriented school or educator would address classroom behavior in a different way.
Yes. I think you're right to start with this critique of the zero tolerance. I think there's some really nice research coming out now to actually show that zero tolerance has really done zero for changing the nature of students' behavior and discipline kinds of issues. I think the work out of Bakersfield and Kern County and showing this incredibly disproportionate high rate of expulsion and suspensions of African American youth is a very chilling reminder that we're not actually educating children if we're kicking them out of schools. And while there may be a racial tint to that, I would argue there is. That's beside the point. It just isn't working. I think we've moved into this new phase that we're often calling restorative justice. I think on the one hand, that's a really positive kind of movement. I also have my critique of it. But I think that one of the things that restorative justice does well when it's done well is it simply changes the paradigm. And I think we always have to start with that. What is it that we believe? And can we be both positive about that and critical of it? That Socratic thing of asking questions of it. It shouldn't be something we should be scared of. If we really want to go with a Western logical, rational kind of thing, great. Let's ask the Socratic kinds of questions. When is this working? When is it not working? And also we should do that of restorative justice. But what I think is at the core of restorative justice for me, where it works really well, is this ethic of caring, this ethic of really building a community. And so one of the things that I think culturally responsive pedagogy can do, and a curriculum that really asks for children's understanding of the worlds in terms of how they do that at home. Every parent wants to raise their child the best they can. And we might argue over the particularities of how that might best look. But what I think it says to us is simple the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Well, that to me is not just a transactional relationship, which I think we often articulate it as, but it really means, do you care about me? Are you concerned about me? A zero-tolerance policy says, I don't actually have the time or the desire to care about you. A restorative justice orientation says, I don't want to just simply incarcerate you or expel you or send you to study hall after school. I actually want to wrestle with the issue right now. Let me go back to the concept I was talking about in terms of bringing the values from home through the dichos and the consejos. One of the things that you'll see constantly in the schools as I go across the nation is if a child is acting out, I may, first of all, ask them just to be quiet. Escalate up a second time, put them in the back of the room. Escalate a third time, stand outside of the classroom for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Escalate again, send them to the principal's office. Well, every one of those episodes means there's no learning going on. And every time it also says is we're not really engaging with this, again, as a community. So one of the things that I want to rethink is if we've created a community, why not try and, quote, solve the problem within the context of the community? So now, rather than asking Juan or Timothy or whomever it is to be outside of the community for acting out, let's try and wrestle with that. Well, we have these values of ways of being. Could we hold each other accountable? In some Latino families, and I'm using this wisely and thoughtfully, there's a chancla, what we use to discipline a child with. We might call that child beating, but the concept is what I'm much more interested in. That is, there's a way of not sparing the rod to spoil the child. Can we use the values as a way to think about disciplining? So in a classroom context, could we have a chancladora, a student who's responsible for helping to solve the problem? So it doesn't always be a teacher-student, which is fraught with all kinds of hierarchy and power. But could we, as a community, solve this problem so that we're looking at both the horizontal and the vertical relations of power, always making that part of the paradigm where we're questioning, why is Timmy acting out? Why is Juan? Well, obviously, if language is a barrier, Juan is probably a little less disinterested in the curriculum. We often know, particularly for young folks of color and particularly males who begin to read slower than young girls do, that they're often behind a grade or so in reading. Well, if the course and the instruction I'm doing from the front of the classroom is reading intensive, and I don't want to, quote, seem dumb, often ways we know young boys act out as a way to not be categorized as stupid vis-a-vis reading. I'd rather have this other moniker, which isn't necessarily healthy, but it certainly beats the other one. So how do we once again not only deal with the discipline, but I want to argue always as the educator in the classroom, question our own pedagogy and curriculum. Am I contributing to the problem? Is Juan or Timothy not engaging and thus acting out? Not because there's something wrong with him, but there's something wrong with my pedagogy, my curriculum, that's disaffecting them. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things that came out of the Tucson case that has been outlawed, and I think is very interesting, is that actually they saw a great increase in student, quote, on task. Now, I'm not certain how you outlaw a program that has students, quote, working on task. That seems to me one of the things that we constantly use as a measure of a successful teacher.
Now, you're talking about the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson Public Schools, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and that actually leads me right into my next question, which was another of the dominant narratives is that the way to improve education is through more standardized curriculum and more standardized high-stakes testing. And combined with that has been this attack in many communities and districts against ethnic studies curriculum. So I'm wondering, if you can, again, help us pull that paradigm apart a little bit. What is wrong with those views, and what would a more culturally relevant, sensitive, and supportive paradigm be?
Sure. I think to begin that discussion, and I'll frame it by the contemporary discussion around the Common Core. And I want to tease out two elements to that, the standardized testing as opposed to the Common Core, because I think that I'm not trying to be an apologist for the Common Core at the initial, but I want to say that if I just look at the Common Core, and I'm here in California, and we could look at the equivalent of the California state content standards for all of the areas, but there's a parallel argument. The Common Core, I think, is that generic, you have your Google Map on your iPhone as an app. You can choose to use it or not use it. Once your district has or your state has adopted it, okay, the app is something you have to use. You don't have to follow all the directions in your Google Map. You may know the shortcuts, not in the shortcuts of cheating out on your teaching, but you may know a better way in terms of what works with your students. And so I think the Common Core is a fine overall paradigm of understanding we need to be thinking about thoughtful teaching, high expectations. The problem for me is that high expectations and thoughtful teaching, critical thinking are such big rhetorical words that I often don't know what they mean. They're great sound bites to come out of Washington and Sacramento and other state capitals, but the challenges for us as teacher educators and educators in the classroom is to work out what that means. And so I think if we begin with, all right, I want my children to think hard and thoughtfully. I want them to be able to read carefully, be able to exposit a text. One of the big terms in Common Core is a close reading of the text. Okay, great. But I can do a close reading around To Kill a Mockingbird as well as I can of Mice and Men, as well as I can of an Octavio Paz poem. So the challenge for me isn't so much feeling that I'm handcuffed. But here's where I really want to come back to teachers. There's a paradigm that I think is really important, that those of us who've been doing teacher education like myself are part of the problem. We create what is often referred to as consumers of curriculum. We teach people, well, here's your Common Core, now go implement it. Here's the New York State kind of set of readings, go implement it. And rather than teaching them deeply how to be theoreticians who can self-construct, to be constructors of curriculum, we teach them how to be consumers, and they passively learn how to take something on, but then don't know how to do that very tight and narrow navigation. And that's where I think we as educators need to step up. Now, obviously, if I have a classroom of students of one particular or even multiple cultural backgrounds, I want to be thoughtful about how do I bring in literature, bring in, again, cultural phenomena. I was teaching a class just yesterday and looking at the work of Jacob Lawrence, the great artist, and he did this beautiful series on the Great Migration of the African-American migration from the South up to the North. And I posed to my students, what did we learn in our own K-12 education about that Great Migration? Roughly 30 students, zero answer. And I said, obviously, we've got work to do. So minimally, if we want to understand even, quote, American history, let alone, quote, unquote, Black or African-American history, which I would argue is all one and part of the same, then we need to do a much better job of rethinking what it is we bring into the classroom. Not simply because we want African-American students to have a better understanding of their history, which we do, but it benefits everybody. It benefits everybody. Now, I think the movement to restrict is part, for me, of a larger discussion of what is censorship, but it's also part of a larger discussion about what is civic engagement and democracy. And democracy, when I think back even to that Jeffersonian notion, is the multiplicity of voices. And even I would argue a multiplicity of voices in Jefferson's own head as a white slave owner, having relations with a black woman. And yet, how do we now, hundreds of years later, think about that? Well, it should be part of our discussion rather than something that we're uncomfortable with and we're pushing under the rug. Not to villainize Jefferson either which way, because I think he's got some great strengths and some great weaknesses, as I think we all do. And how do we then think through the deep and thoughtful questions? A culturally relevant pedagogy, I think, is essential, not just for the self-esteem of youth, though it is incredibly important there. But I think you can do the exact same kind of critical thinking, the exact same kind of deep questioning, but now you get that additional benefit. Well, if schools are not working for Latinos, not working for African Americans, then why continue to use the same curriculum if it's proven itself unequivocally to not be effective? It seems to me, whether we're talking as a business person from a value-added curriculum, if we can increase student engagement, increase student matriculation into higher education, then there's value added. And if it requires us to rethink and maybe use a political text, I'm all for that. Not because I just want to be revolutionary, though I do. I just want kids to succeed and do well. I don't see anyone who would want to argue against that as an ethic of good public schooling. But I think it really requires us to ask that deeper question. And that's the question, what is the point of public education? And we've had a very mixed history on this. Schools initially were created, obviously, to empower white landowners, the passing on of knowledge to their sons, not even women. Ladies, we had to wait until the 19th Amendment to even put you guys on the table. That was a long history, the civil rights movement, And so it's required us to rethink education. I think in many ways, obviously, the Brown v. Board of Education decision transformed schools. But in many ways, we look at 2014, we're equally as racially segregated, if not more, than we were in the era of Brown. That should be a problem that is not just requiring of a culturally relevant pedagogy, but should be actually part of the debate of what it means to do good schools. We should return to the Little Rock Nine, just not to understand how they integrated schools, but what did good schooling look like? We should think about the walkouts in L.A. by Chicanos, not just to understand a political movement, and I'd love to see some kids walking out now of some schools, but also, how does that just help us to understand equity? What does that help us to understand educational excellence? I would love to get a group of kids who are seeing their classmates dropping out to be advocates, not just for their own benefit, but for advocates for those kids who are dropping out. That requires a class analysis. That requires a race analysis. That requires a linguistic analysis, as well as what is good thinking. And if a value added of a culturally relevant pedagogy gets me that, I'll go for it.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. What makes you most concerned about the future of education, and what makes you most hopeful?
This may sound ironic, but it's one and the same. Those folks coming into the profession. I've been blessed by being able to work at the graduate level in teacher education. Now I'm working principally at the undergraduate, so I'm getting a few more years to work with them rather than just the maybe 1 or 2 years of the credential program, but now I'm working the 4 years of the undergraduate as well as the credential. I'm concerned both that when I bring some of the students in at 17 and 18, the only experience by which they have to reflect upon and to be critical of public schooling is their own. And for some students who've been undereducated, they don't actually have an alternative paradigm. They don't have a way to constantly rethink, well, what is a good education, because they've been undereducated. And so part of my challenge is we've got a lot of work as the teacher educators to help them be critical of. I'm working with a group of Latinas that I've been mentoring now for about 2 years, 14 young women, amazing young women, who when they came in were all highly successful by this one measure. They graduated from high school, matriculated to college, which means they're already ahead of 50% of their other Latinos. But they came in and they were successful. Some of them had been in great programs like AVID, which give them an additional boost of understanding how to do that avenue to college and exposure to the great Socratic method in the classroom. But they didn't know how to look at their classmates who were, quote, in the regular curriculum and not see that that was maybe not racially segregated, but was academically segregated. So how do we take what we know works incredibly well? The Puente program, for instance, which has been wonderfully researched by Patricia Gándara and others, shows us how we can create some really great programs, particularly to help youth of color who've been unsuccessful. But it's really only for 5, 10, 15% of a student population. That's not equity. That's not ensuring all kids are learners. So one of the challenges is, how do we help future teachers, who I think are the bedrock of what we do every day, day in and day out? Obviously, it requires superintendents who have great policies and principals who can be great instructional leaders and great advocates at the legislature who can finally put some money back into the kitty. But it's the teacher, irrespective of those things, who still has to do the same work. Governor Brown wants to increase the salaries. Great, I'll go for that. But I still have to do that work every day. So that concerns me. But it's also the possibility of hope. Maxine Greene, the great philosopher in arts education who recently passed, speaks about the ability to imagine otherwise. So if there's one thing that I would actually encourage us to think about, even with a culturally relevant pedagogy, is what are the role for the arts, and particularly arts that come out of our own communities, to help us reimagine our own K-12 experience and something that is even more contributing to democracy, something that's even more contributing to dropping the high dropout rates, to something that increases our ways of understanding. That might be, for instance, a way, going back to one of your earlier questions about the prison pipeline. How could we rethink public education as a way to not, quote, solve that problem because we're dealing with prisons and incarceration, but rather keeping kids engaged so they don't believe that that is their only option? 50 Cent said it, get rich or die trying. And I think for some youth for whom there isn't that hope. And I want to see how is that hope crystallized in the intellectual ways and in the heart ways that we prepare teachers. NCLB was great for giving us this moniker, a highly qualified teacher. And that's usually done because you pass a test. But there's nothing in that highly qualified teacher definition that says, do you have a heart full of cariño? Do you have empathy for the communities in which you're working? Do you fundamentally believe that parents should be part of their children's education? Now, I would suggest if we expanded No Child Left Behind to have this incredible empathy and caring kind of curriculum to it, and we had a test to figure out how we're going to do that, boom, I'd go all with No Child Left Behind, because then I think we would be empowering the teachers who weren't necessarily empowered themselves to, quote, give back to their communities, but now with a critical thoughtfulness, now with an understanding of how to be creators of curriculum and not just consumers, who really believe, even though I wasn't taught in Spanish, I'd love to be able to do that. Even though my culture wasn't part of my own K-12 experience, except for maybe in a little bit of stuff, then I'm going to do that. And maybe now, those kindergarten and first grade students who I started with who didn't graduate with me, the next generation, I can imagine it otherwise.
Yes, that really addresses a very expansive whole in a very narrow way of thinking about improving education. Anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered today?
The joy of being able to do this work for, again, nearly 30 years of teaching in classrooms, teaching teacher educators, is that I'm even more hopeful now than I was when I was doing my doctoral program and working in schools in my first days, in great part because I think the longevity of doing this work is essential. And this comes back to your earlier question about what causes me concern and gives me hope. We have a turnover rate in the teacher profession that is abysmal. If I was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I don't know if I would be fired, but I think I should have been fired. We need to rethink how, as a nation and as a society, we give respect to the teaching profession. And I just don't mean the discourse that takes place and the blaming that goes on, the partisan battles between Teach for America and charter school movements. I think we have to have that as part of our reasoned debate on what is good public education. And I think we need to question some of the for-profit movement and some of the ways in which, we have de-invested in public education. There's a wonderful piece that was put out from first to worst out of Stanford, some great folks out of Stanford, who wanted to look at California's movement from being the top public education system nationwide to the worst. And there's a beautiful contrast between schools in Lafayette and Orinda and schools in Richmond. And I don't mean to villainize either or make either heroic, but it was incredibly interesting in this representation of the ways in which economic inequality created that. And thus there were really two different school districts. I think we need to reimagine how do we understand civic responsibility as a nation, as a California, as a Bay Area. We talk about the diversity of the Bay Area as something we laud and we're appreciative of. But how do we take that then and talk about educational equity that goes along with that cultural, racial diversity? We all love being able to go out and eat the variety of cultural foods, but are we equally taking responsibility for the educational excellence of that same population and the ways in which we look at that? Those are the institutional and structural frames that I think are often left out of the debate. We often bring the discussion down to, well, you're a good teacher or you're a poor teacher. It's interesting, if you look at the research, virtually every parent thinks of their child's teacher as a good teacher. Well, if that's the case, then schools should be doing wonderfully, but in fact, they're not. So how do we have multiple levels of discussion? The economic issue at the national level, the federal level, state standards issues, nationwide standards, not vilifying either side, but really thinking through, is there something positive that can come out of here? But thinking about how do we, as communities, larger than just the hills of Oakland, the lowlands of Oakland, the hills of Berkeley, the lowlands of Berkeley, to use my local context, East Palo Alto, separated by the 101, and very stark contrasts. You can go virtually every major metropolitan city and see how freeways or major streets divide economic inequality. How do we begin to reshape a city as a place of refuge, as a place of investment? Whether we take that from a religious mandate, whether we take that from a civic mandate of democracy, whether we take that from a cultural mandate, I think we could play with all of those as ways to think of healing the city as a unified group. That we're not there yet. And I hope that the work that we're doing in K through 12 classrooms isn't just about how to do algorithms, how to understand meiosis and mitosis, but how do we actually help children through activities like service learning, for instance, through community-based projects, actually engage and believe that they can be part of the solution as a third grader. No, you don't have to wait until you've gone to Harvard and gotten a college education to, quote, make a difference. But you can make a difference because of the ways in which, again, homes and schools are not worlds apart, but are integrated. Can we think about a community-based organization there? And that could be a process for bringing charter schools, which are often seen as depleting good public schools, and public schools, religious schools out of the Catholic tradition that have a long history of providing quality education for low-income and minority kids. Could that be a way of partnering across these divisions? That requires an imagination that I don't think most public educators, particularly at the policy level, have. That would be one way that I would ask us to reimagine that kind of dialogue. How could, through even KPFA, could we have a dialogue? We often see this, for instance, I think wonderfully in the civil rights movement, of the linking between religious leaders and civic leaders. I'm not certain we've studied our history well, so as to know that that should be part of the dialogue that we're doing in K-12 education. We talk about studying the civil rights movement. I'm not certain we've done it well.
Service learning is the idea that you teach academic curriculum through a community service that actually meets a genuine community need. And in the 90s up into the early 2000s, there was a lot of service learning in the Bay Area. And then you see much less of it today. which to me is partially a result of this whole push around high-stakes testing and people believing that it's not necessarily going to show the kinds of results on standardized tests. What happened to service learning, and what would we need to do in order to reinvigorate that? Because at one time it was very vibrant here.
I think you're right. I think this push for the standardized testing and thus the number of days that I believe as a teacher I'm required because of the peer pressure, because of the institutional pressure to set aside just to teach my kids to the test, prep them for the test, do the test, and then just maybe take a week off just to recoup from the test, has cut our 180 regular days of teaching in a traditional maybe down to even 100. It's that obnoxious, I would argue. Here's, I think, one of the things where, again, going back to what gives me concern and what gives me hope. I think it's my responsibility and my colleagues in schools of education to help politicize, and I'm going to use this word cautiously, our teachers, not in the political sense of the left or the right, but to politicize them in the sense of remembering, darn it, this is our profession. And the only people who are letting us, quote, be pushed around is we the people. We the people. Can we begin as future educators, as current educators, as retired educators, the whole gambit, to say, wait a minute, let's think about taking back those 80 days that we lost to testing. Let's be the ones that are pushing Sacramento, Washington, rather than Washington, Sacramento pushing us. We often vilify the teacher unions as being too left or not to the right enough and therefore partisan. Okay, let's be partisan. Partisan about good education. And I think that one of the things that we've done is a disservice to our own profession, where we were part of the process of giving away service learning. Parker Palmer, the great educator, talks about what he calls the Rosa Parks principle. And he said that she used to get on the bus, as blacks were required to do, and drop their nickel or dime in the front of the bus in the machine, but then walk back off the front of the bus, walk to the back of the bus and get on the back in the black section, the colored section. And he said that on that day, when she was part of a much larger movement, not just a single day and not just a single woman, but part of a larger movement of folks that were thinking about this, is that she made the decision to no longer be a co-conspirator in her own demise by legitimizing the law. That when she decided to stand up for it, she said, I had been complicit by getting on the front and then getting off and then getting on the back. I think we've been slightly complicit as public school ed, not slightly, very much complicit in giving that up. Can we make a case for service learning like we did back then? Again, studying history, we look at the Black Panthers here in Oakland, right? And we laud them for the free lunch programs that are really free and reduced lunch programs nationwide. Okay, cool. Not just because that's a political thing, not just because it's a, up with the African-American black is beautiful kind of thing, which is part of that larger discourse I want to get at, but also part of it just means I'm educating the whole child by looking at education and food and healthiness. Now, can we begin to think about service not just as an add-on, not just as something that's quaint and sweet and we plant a garden, but something as revolutionary as we have a real need, hunger in the community. How do we address that? Hunger hasn't gone away, and not just in Oakland, right? You hear all, particularly during the recession, of quote, middle-class folks that were going to food banks, and the food banks were at record lows because there was such a run on them. How do we reimagine that as a possibility? In the Latino community, the increase in diabetes and obesity, we have an epidemic. We need to begin to rethink about that. That's not something that ends when you get to college and you go off to medical school. Can we begin to rethink? We look at Alice Waters' great program here in the Bay Area and the food lunch program. I'm still working in schools in which you can buy fiery Cheetos at lunchtime. That should be against the law. But how can we take that model, make that part of, like Alice wanted to do, the entire curriculum from 8 to 3, not just the after-school program, and particularly for an affluent community, but part of every community. And that's just an easy example. Could we begin to look at the ways in which economics, politics, all of that should be part of the larger discourse that links us up to a problem in the community, and the kids don't see themselves as somebody someday because they can create a solution, but they see themselves as somebody today as solvers of the problem. Then I think that what the heck am I learning in math now becomes relevant because I'm actually using it. What the heck am I learning in science now it becomes relevant, and I can actually use that to better my neighborhood, my family. I'm actually working tomorrow night, 8 o'clock till 10 o'clock in the evening, intentionally in the dark, taking a small group of my students out to do some photography work in what's called the east side of Salinas. And the east side is like the east side in many urban communities. It's long forgotten. Low levels of educational attainment, high immigration rate, and if you know that part of Salinas and the surrounding area, highly agricultural. High gangs, all the violence, the regular rhetoric. And what we're trying to do is switch that paradigm. And now I'm taking my college students who concern me, trying to help them to see hope, not because I'm doing that, but I'm connecting them up now with some of the high school kids that I've been working with. And my high school kids are the teachers. So we're doing a service learning project where the community has said, we want to change the narrative of how we're seen. And we want to do that in the minds of the teachers who, quote, want to come back here 2 years later and teach in my school. Well, if I don't help them know what I think as a high school kid, think about what is good education, then they're not going to educate me well. So I'm doing this, one, to change the narrative. Two, empower some high school students to knock my college kids up the top of the head and help them rethink what is a good education. Help my college kids rethink what does it mean to be a teacher and why teaching in a low-income community of color might be actually an important, essential kind of a thing. Now I'm shifting, once again, the paradigm, where it's not just learning is what we do, but learning is who we are. And who we are people who are connected across race, across class, across gender. And we have this possibility. I have this young woman who's going to be the leader of this, my high school student. I've been working with her since 7th grade. She's been in and out of the school. One of the brightest young women, but traditional school has not worked with her. I can get her to show up from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, read the same academic articles that my college students are working. She won't do that in the high school context because the institution isn't working for her. But she now feels that the community that I've enwrapped her with, the high school and college students who are Latinas like her, who care about her, she's willing to do the work because of that ethic of caring. That's how we could build a service learning model that would once again tell the community, you're not just a school separate from us, but you're part of us. We talk about neighborhood schools and community schools. Let's really make them something that is in the neighborhood.
Very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Our guest has been Dr. Miguel Lopez, Associate Professor of Multicultural and Social Justice Education at California State University, Monterey Bay. Miguel Lopez, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your wisdom, and your inspiration with us today.
It's been my pleasure. I hope we'll do this again.
Absolutely.